Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So this is the last talk in our weekend retreat on mindfulness of breathing, and it's been a very nice 2 days, a sort of intimate crew here at the Cascade Hermitage. And one of the teachings which I found the most instructive in my own practice, and which I think provides this very practical means towards realization of deep states of concentration and joy. And I spoke in the last talk around this distinction I've heard recently around different sorts of consciousness. Once again, by this researcher who wrote a book called The Genius, what do they call it? Baby Genius? Philosophical Baby. So, I think there's a movie called Baby Geniuses or something, but I'm not sure. Yeah, it's a bit different. So, Philosophical Baby, about how children reside in this state of learning, and intelligent creatures tend to have long childhood periods where they are in the state of constant learning in proportion to their intelligence. And one of the few exceptions being octopi, which are very intelligent but have almost no childhood. But they think that how they overcome that is by splitting their nervous system into the sort of learning element, which is contained in the tentacles. Their nervous system spread throughout their body, and their more focused, task-oriented element, which is contained in the head. And this researcher was drawing a distinct parallel between sort of spotlight consciousness, which is what many of us, especially with our Western upbringing, reside in most of the time, which is very focused, and versus lantern consciousness, which is wide and receptive. And I believe some of the parallel was that adults spend most of their time in the spotlight consciousness, and that this is also how meditation practice has been taught in many circles, is to focus on one point, whereas children spend their lives much more in this sort of lantern, receptive, wide awareness, and that's more akin to certain, say, open practices of awareness. And this researcher was pointing to a third sort of consciousness, which has not gotten spoken to a lot, of play. And play being a completely different mind state, according to the MRIs, where one is very engaged. And once again, I think that paradigm is perhaps one of the more useful ones to look at the approach to meditation in. One of the beauties of the Ānāpānasati sutta and breath meditation in general is it allows for this, especially as contained in the sutta, with its really robust arsenal of techniques and approaches to becoming acquainted with the breath body and the breath energies, and using them in very skillful ways with applied perceptions and visualizations to calm the mind and brighten the heart. And that because the landscape of this sutta and the landscape of the breath that kind of maps out is so variegated, then one can use it in many ways, and you can really play with it and experiment and have fun, and that this can really serve to use the active mind rather than work against it until it calms down naturally and maybe settles into a state of more lantern-like or at times spotlight-like awareness. But perhaps what we're aiming for is a bit more in the end a lantern-like awareness, a sort of unification of mind, but with a wide field of the body in awareness. But that the approach to that, looking at that as play, and really, Ajahn Jeff says that one has to think like a thief when approaching these meditation practices, and that one's defilements, one's negative mental states are also working to block things, and so one has to sort of figure out ways around them. After I brought that up in the last talk, one of the people here brought up an image that had come to her when I was speaking about it, of how when one becomes skilled at playing an instrument, one uses both hands usually. There comes a point with any instrument where one is required to accomplish two very different tasks with either hand, and that usually each hand actually seems to parallel one of those types of consciousness. So, for example, with playing a violin, the bow hand, which I used to play, could be considered a bit like lantern consciousness, maybe. It's very smooth, and there's much more a focus on quality and tenor. And whereas the hand that fingers the fingerboard is much more exacting, refined, task-oriented, less focused on, say, the tenor of the situation or of the note. And I really liked that, especially since it seemed like it spoke to how play, this concept of the play mind state, fits in and incorporates both of those other mind states, in that when one is really using both hands skillfully, then one can be said to be playing the instrument. And when I think of what it means to play, it is this sort of flipping back and forth and balancing between lantern and spotlight consciousness a bit. You know, you narrow in and then you taste how that worked and take a taste of the whole tenor of the situation, and then try something else and then see how that worked. And there's this constant interplay of both types. So I thought that was a beautiful image, and it spoke to an analogy and a language that I think is very powerful to use when speaking about the Dhamma, which is that of music. The word that the Buddha uses as a prefix to each factor of the Noble Eightfold Path to denote correct. So correct view, right intention, right action, right speech, and so on. The word is samma, which can be translated as harmonious. And it's true that in the suttas, it's in the context of the Noble Eightfold Path, it's contrasted with the word miccha, which means just wrong. But still, this word samma has interesting connotations, and there's certainly places in the suttas where it's used to speak to harmony. And one of the benefits which I was pointing to around mindfulness of breathing and of really developing that path is that as one becomes acquainted with the body and the sense of the breath and of the somatic sense, one also gains access to the heart and to an intuitive awareness of the correct path, of a pure path. And sometimes that small voice, which I know the Christians sometimes refer to as the personal God, but I think which we might better think of as sort of a bit of an intuitive awareness of what's skillful in any given time. That sometimes maybe it does manifest as a very clearly articulated thought, like get out, or just let go. But sometimes it's much more a sense of harmony or disharmony. And even more so, as we progress along this path, so frequently the choices are no longer between a stark right and wrong, but rather the aesthetic of the beautiful and the unbeautiful. So rather than after you come across a sink full of dishes, asking yourself, is it right for me to just leave them there? I mean, they're not my dishes, or wrong. And fair enough, it might be right for you to go. But if you ask yourself, what's beautiful right now? That is a question that you know the answer to. And that word kalyani, which is beautiful, and it's the word that we use to denote spiritual friendship, is kalyanamitta, beautiful friend. I think somehow that aesthetic resonates with this idea of harmonious as well. And what's harmonious in a given situation? Where does that intuitive sense of harmony guide us? And also it speaks to the profound sense of strength one gets when one aligns oneself with purpose, with path, with morality. And we spoke yesterday about how when one's sila, one's sense of morality is well established, then a sense of play and freedom actually manifest from that, strangely. And I find there's truth to that, in that when one aligns oneself with one's better nature and potential, then there's a sense of stability that comes. It's like when you pluck the string of an instrument, and every instrument that's tuned to the same note around it will begin to resonate subtly and quietly. And similarly, when the Buddha spoke of why one should hold the 8 precepts for one day every week at least, or at least the 5 precepts, why one should hold a more clear and clean morality at least one day a week, the recollection he gives is the noble ones live without taking life. The noble ones live without stealing, without lying, without engaging in sexuality, without taking intoxicants. For one day, why don't I also live that way? And for me, this speaks to the sense of something in us does intuit our potential. And when we're in harmony with that, there's profound strength. And the Buddha says that one of the benefits of keeping good sila is that one fears nothing, and one does not fear death. And that doesn't always make sense at first sight, or at first listen. But my sense is there's something very true about when one has come into deep harmony with what one is supposed to do and intuits about one's highest potential and course of action, then there's a profound sense of strength and security in that. And perhaps we know it most by when it disappears, when you break sila. And when the Buddha was speaking about unbroken sila, he said, the sila, one's morality, is unbroken, unspotted, unsplattered, untorn. And that image of tearing is the best image I can think of for what happens when one breaks sila. It's a nail ripping through clean cloth. And the immediate sense of dissolution, you can feel it in your body, the weakening, the disintegration, and coming out of harmony with something which was so precious and so deep that you feel. And that's how you begin to know more and more what it feels like to be in harmony. And this manifests internally in terms of knowing your proper course, but also when you step into these currents of practice and of goodness, you find yourself suddenly in the company of others and of spiritual friends who are walking right with you. And you are held, truly. And that is no small thing. And you're in harmony with them. There's also a famous, or a sutta I really love, where the Buddha, this monk and this layman are debating how many sorts of feeling the Buddha teaches. 3, pleasure, pain, neither pleasure nor pain, or just pleasure and pain. And so they're arguing, and then Venerable Ananda takes the question to the Buddha, and the Buddha says, they're both right. I've taught 2 sorts of feeling, 3 sorts of feeling, 6 sorts of feeling, 108 sorts of feeling. And and then he says, however, basically I expound the Dhamma in many different ways, depending on the situation. And then he goes through defining happiness according to increasingly refined states, going up through the jhanas. And he ends with an amazing moment of purposefully circular definition of sukha, of pleasure, of happiness, where he says, wherever sukha is found in whatever way, that the Tathagata, the Buddha, defines as sukha. And it's a logician might look at that and just think it's a lazy cop-out. But what it speaks to is the fact that, and there's another sutta where the Buddha says that what the noble ones experience as pleasure, the worldlings experience as pain. And what the worldlings experience as pleasure, the noble ones experience as pain, or as dukkha. And we're all worldlings, by the way. It's okay. And what I think it speaks to is that our definition of pleasure changes as we practice. Initially, it is the Avengers movie. That is pleasure. But as one's mind becomes refined and practice progresses, then suddenly that's actually dukkha. That's stressful and coarse and too much. And sitting at home meditating is pleasurable. Whereas for people I know, many people, that sounds just horrible. And so on and so forth through very refined states of concentration. An unbelievably refined state of concentration, after a skilled meditator resides in it for a time, they see the suffering in that too, and that becomes dukkha. And the best analogy I can think of for this ladder of dukkha sukha and of the Buddha's purposeful definition of sukha in terms of itself, so that it's allowed to shift as one progresses in practice, which is brilliant because it lets us use it at every step to define itself and then to let go of that definition. Dukkha is defined the same way. And for me, it's as if the best analogy is that of octaves or keys of music, and how one senses that as one's life and practice move, one is moving up octaves, up keys of music. And what was harmonious in one key last year no longer is. And there's a whole new set of notes which suddenly are harmonious, and new friends and activities which make sense. And this is how we play. We harmonize ourselves with more and more refined melodies, and we play in harmony with those around us. And something deep in us begins to intuit the score that we're meant to be following, or that might be too strong of language, that we know we're capable of following at our best. And we create an empty space in our lives so that there's room for that music to resonate. Otherwise, we're like a bell stuffed with cotton. And we have one hand navigating the more refined, task-oriented elements, and we have one hand holding the tenor. And that's how we play. So I think the Dhamma is music is a good way of thinking of things in many ways. And my hope is that this sutta gives people some practical scales to work on. So best of luck.